I think what might be important as an introduction, though, is the reason that we've asked Helen to come and sit here among her friends and among those who love her to tell the story of how GIM began. It seems to be a companion piece to the story that we heard the other day, the story of the Grail. The story of the Grail sets forth our vision, and here we have set forth our memories. And it's the kind of story that I think, and our beginnings, it's the kind of story I think that can be told over and over and over again and never grow old. And so we've asked Helen to come here and to do that, to answer for us the question, how did it all start? So Helen, how did it all start?
In preparation for this talk today, Roseanne said to me, now don't prepare for it, Helen, just come and speak. And so I didn't. But you know how it is when you're preparing for something, you think. You dream, you wake up in the morning, thinking, now, which one of the stories shall I tell? During the music, I was thinking, well, it's 47 years ago when I got the beginning inspiration for GIM. But then my second thought was, well, it's really from the time we're born, isn't it? I think that we're all here because probably we've had a lot of music in our homes, or there have been certain influences in our lives, very often when we're very young children, that bring us to this place. So you're all very special people, not only to me, but I think to the future of music and art and psychology and the whole world and the whole universe. Because I know that you would not be in AMI if you hadn't had enough experience in GIM, and that your experiences are the same as mine and everyone else's. That the inspiration that comes to you through this work is kind of a universal inspiration. So I'd like to go back to my own childhood. I was very fortunate in that my mother was a pianist and an organist, and my first thoughts of music or understanding of music was when I was going to sleep. She would play the Chopin nocturnes to me as I went to sleep. And so it wasn't very long until I was also going to the piano, and I was little, so I was doing this on the piano from my position at 2 or 3 years of age. So it made all kinds of sense for me to, first of all, go into piano, which I did. By the time I was about 6 and a half, I was doing so well that I gave a little recital. And unfortunately, we moved away from my teacher, whom I still think lovingly. And one thing I always think about my teacher was not only the gentle way with which she taught me how to play, but that she had some wonderful perfume. And I used to love to go to my lessons and smell that perfume. How important the senses are, particularly when we're young. Well, I moved out to Kansas and from New York State, and my next piano teacher wasn't such an interesting person. So I actually lost interest in the piano, and it was at one of our school assemblies that a violinist got up and played, and she got a lot of attention after that. They clapped, and then, teacher gave her a lot of attention. I thought, I think that's something I would like. So I begged my mother for a violin, and she was very upset. She thought I was going to be a pianist. So she bought me a $10 violin, 3/4 size. Sounded terrible. But I fell in love with it and kept on, and then she got me a better one. So it was during my school years and my high school years that I was a fairly shy child, and one way in which I could get attention, and which I really enjoyed, being in front of people and playing. So I did a lot of playing, and I did well. Violin was one way, and music was one way for me to express my feelings, which were hard to express otherwise. So I went to the Oberlin Conservatory of Music and got a degree in violin performance. And as with my parents, I met my husband there. He was in the School of Theology. And I prepared myself to be a minister's wife. Well, one of the things that I discussed with him before we were married, I said, well, what are the things that a minister's wife has to do? And he said, oh, you know, go to meetings, be nice to people, introduce them, listen to my sermons. And I said, well, how about prayers? Do I have to pray? And because I really would feel very strange about doing that. And he said, well, sometimes at church dinners or at women's meetings, they'll ask you to pray. And I said, well, you know, that's going to be difficult. And he said, well, memorize some prayers. So I did that. I didn't feel very good about it. A number of years into our ministry, and we were living in southern Kansas at the time, I had read some books about Dr. Frank Laubach. He was very well known for the work that he did in literacy. And he had a method by which he called each one teach one. He went around the world and he would teach people who couldn't read and write how to go back to their villages and teach them how to read and write. And so he was best known for that, but I knew him as a missionary who had been a missionary in the Philippines and had written about his experiences there, and had written a book on prayer. And I'd read the book on prayer and was very touched by it. So I gathered some of the church ladies together, and I said, this authority on prayer is speaking up in Manhattan, which incidentally is only about an hour from where I live now. But I think we're going to have to stay overnight if we go to this conference. And one of the women who was going with me was a pianist, and I said, I'm going to take my violin along because we have a performance in several days. And so she was in the group, and I remember that morning we got up very early to drive and get there in time. And it was one of the most beautiful sunrises I have ever seen. The sky was just filled with a glorious gold and yellow and black. It was gorgeous. And we talked about prayer quite a bit, I think, on our way up. Well, we listened to Dr. Laubach, who was very interesting, in morning and afternoon. And then because we were staying all night, the minister said, now, Helen, tonight we're going to have a meeting for Dr. Laubach. And since I noticed you have your violin, will you play? And I thought, sure, I've got my violin and my pianist. So we went to a back room and we practiced the piece. And suddenly Dr. Laubach came in the room and he said, oh, that music is so beautiful. It's just like God is speaking through your music. And of course that pleased me. And so that night when I got up to play, I looked over at him and he was kind of bowing his head. And the thoughts that went through my mind were, oh, well, that's nice, he's in prayer. And then the second thought was, well, you know, that's one time you do pray is right before you play. So you don't make mistakes, and so you can please your parents and your teacher. And that all went through my mind before I played. And the number I chose was Swan from Carnival of Animals by Saint-Saëns. And so we played the first melody part, the first theme, and the the bridge, and came back to the original theme. And then something very unusual happened. This gorgeous music came out of my violin, and I was shocked. I was startled at first, and but I thought, well, don't stop playing, just go on playing. And so I did go on playing, but I guess back then I was as interested in research as I am now. So I thought, well, I'll stop the vibrato. You know, the vibrato is the kind that makes the tone pretty. And I'll play the notes, but I won't vibrato or do the things with the bow that make it sound pretty. Made absolutely no difference at all with the tone. And that startled me even more. It was just poured out of the violin. When it was finished, I sat down in the front row, and Dr. Laubach got up and he said, "Oh, that music was so gorgeous, I can't talk." He said, "Let's just meditate." So we all sat and meditated for a while, and he usually talked about an hour, but this time he talked about 15 minutes, and he said, I want more of that music. I wondered if the young lady, and I was pretty young at that time, would get up and play again. Well, here I was shaking from the experience. But I thought, well, if it happened once, it may happen again. So I chose the Ave Maria by Bach Gounod to play. And of course, the first few notes were very shaky. I couldn't control it. But again, the same thing happened. This gorgeous, gorgeous music. If anything, it was even more beautiful. It was almost like I was standing back there and listening. I put my violin away at the end of the meeting, went to my hostess' home, and was awake all night. And then I realized in the morning that the closest experience that I knew of was the conversion of St. Paul. And I thought, I hadn't heard of conversion through music. So I went home, and this aura kept on. Those of you who've had peak experiences or high experiences, you know that everything looks different. You see the individual leaves on the trees, the flowers are beautiful, everything's wonderful. And actually it lasted for days. I got up early in the morning and would walk, and was happy all the time. And I thought I would test it for a couple of weeks, and then I would write to Dr. Laubach. So I did, and his letter in return said that it had been a very high experience for him, and that in order to keep this experience, that I should gather around a little group, a prayer group, and that I should read my Bible and pray and meditate. So that's what I did. It was so profound that I just gathered one lady who I told this experience to, and she was very interested in starting a group. And so we got together and prayed, and then several other names came up, and we had a wonderful time. Now, this was back in 1948, 49. That was before we did, nowadays people do the laying on of hands and they go to hospitals and we talk about healing, but in those days it wasn't considered, kosher in the regular church. And but we did those things. We went to the hospital, and we were biblical in laying on hands and doing all these exciting things, and exciting things did happen as a result of it. I started reading books on prayer, and the only books around were those of Evelyn Underhill on mysticism. And then I went into got a Catholic friend who gave me some of the literature from the great saints of the Catholic Church. And I really involved myself very deeply in it. Well, I got what you call a spiritual indigestion. Have any of you had that? You get so involved in this that you don't pay attention to your family and other things that are important in your life. And my husband, good as he was complaining a little bit. What are the other things that happen once you start to delve deeply into yourself spiritually? You all know, I'm sure. Other things come up, don't they, from the unconscious? And that started happening, and I started having some psychological problems. And this was very troubling to me, but from my reading, I knew this would be part of the process. What was even more troubling was that was in the era of Freudian psychology. And I read enough to know that if I went and told about my spiritual experiences, that I perhaps wouldn't get a very good reception. So I probably didn't seek out the best professional persons. Now this period was a long period. It was a period of about 10 years of exploring all of these things, getting to know myself. Fortunately, there were camps called Camps Farthest Out, where people in the traditional churches could go and share with others in the belief of prayer. Actually, we did some drawing and writing and artwork at those times, and movement. And I had a delightful time doing what was called rhythm choir, where I think they do it liturgical dance, they call it now, and I had a group in my church. So I learned a lot of things that I think I brought into GIM from those camps. Those camps are still going. They're going internationally now. I met my friend Dr. Laubach and Glenn Clark and many others at that time. So those were the things that fed me and supported me during this period. Toward the end of this period, I went to a pastoral counselor who gave me some good advice or help. And what he said was, I think being a minister's wife is maybe a little too, isn't enough for you, Helen. That perhaps because the children, I had 3 children and they were growing up, you need to do something maybe with your music that's a little closer to where you are. And I think he was very right. It was toward the beginning of the New Age alternative movement in the early 60s, when we had talked about the women's movement was starting. And there were those of us who had too much energy just to keep at home or doing the usual pastoral assistant duties. So I started looking around. This was in 1960. And I thought there were one of 3 things I want to do. Either I would want to go into church work, maybe into pastoral education, or I might go back and get a master's degree in violin. And then I heard about music therapy. Now, I had been talking about this experience throughout the years of the music, the violin experience, and it had never been repeated, and it hasn't to this day. And so I thought, music therapy, that sounds wonderful. Maybe I can help in some way for others to get into the kind of experience that I had that was so life-changing for me. I lived in Kansas City at the time and was very fortunate to live close to Lawrence, which incidentally was my hometown. Because in Lawrence was Dr. E. Thayer Gaston, who is considered the father of music therapy. And so I went in and talked to him. And I told him about this experience with music and told him it was part of the generating interest in my going into music therapy. I'll never forget a very dynamic man, fairly small man, but dynamic. And he leaned over his desk and he went like this to me and he says, Helen, I will accept you into the music therapy program, but I don't want you to mention mysticism once. He says, this was the 1960s. We're very much into behaviorism. And if you're willing to go along with the program. So, my friends had said, well, Helen, if you want to go and play in hospitals and work musically, therapy. In therapy, you have the tools. You have a degree in violinist. Why don't you go ahead and do it? But I'm very happy that I realized that I needed the professional training. So I took the 2 extra years. I got another degree, actually, in music education. And then I went immediately into a program they had, a master's degree program. Because I had learned that indeed they were interested in behaviorism. Indeed, they weren't interested in mysticism at all. And, but I had read about Masterman and some of the humanistic people. And I thought, well, I will go into research and I will find a way on my own. So I did get a master's degree and worked actually as a secretary for NAMT for 2 years there in Lawrence. You know, every time in your life when you do something new, you learn something that's going to help later on. Well, I wasn't the secretarial kind of person, but during those 2 years I had to learn how to more or less manage an organization, and that became very important later on when we started ICN. So it got me acquainted with many people in the music therapy field as well. So I continued to live in Topeka and travel to Lawrence. In Topeka, in the meantime, a very interesting family moved in, the Elmer Greens, Elmer Green of Biofeedback. In Topeka also I had a small prayer meditation group, and his daughter became interested in that group. And through her, I became acquainted with the Greens. I also did the research for my master's degree at the VA hospital in Topeka. And while I was there, I met Dr. Kenneth Godfrey. That meeting was really important to me. He was just starting the work with the LSD there at the VA hospital. It had started out in California, and he had traveled out there and had decided that at the VA hospital they could do some work with alcoholics. So he was starting the work there and had heard through the grapevine, maybe through Elmer Green and some of the others, that I was a person who had a meditation group and that I was into what they call mysticism at that time. So I was down in the research area working on my project when this small man walked in. Well, he had a blue suit on, but it wasn't the blue suit. I looked at this man, and he definitely had an aura. Now, I'm not one of these people that sees auras. You know, there are folks who see auras around folks, but he walked in, he had bright blue eyes in this blue suit, and I looked at him and I thought, that must be an aura around him. And he came up to me and introduced himself, and he said, I'm Dr. Kenneth Godfrey, and I've heard that you're interested in meditation and those kinds of things. And I nearly fell over backward. Here in this Freudian area was this gentleman, and he said, tell me about it. So we started talking, and he said, I'm into hypnotherapy, and I want to know about the meditation that you do. So he said, is it all right if we get together? So what happened over the next year and a half was I, who had been going to therapists all this time and getting essentially no help, was getting help, free help, from this fine psychiatrist. And he was teaching me about altered states using hypnosis. And then I was turning about in the next session, I was getting him into altered states through meditation approaches. And so we were teaching one another. What was wonderful for me was that eventually through the imagery that came, through the hypnotic techniques, I was able to uncover the problem that was giving me the depression. And it had to do with a younger brother who had died when I was about 5, very impressionable time. And in those times, they didn't acquaint the children with the death. And they don't have the preparation that we have now. We both had pneumonia, and he died and I lived. And so they didn't tell me for a week or so, and I couldn't go to his funeral. And my brother and I had a fight about a month earlier, and I had been punished for something that he had done. And I was very angry at him. So I think it was the matter of the death, and I realized when I was an adult that I felt perhaps I had killed him because of that combination. Very powerful combination. But so tremendous to get through it, through an imagery process. And from that time until now, I've not had any problems of that sort with depression. But of course, it's been very valuable to me in my GIM work that I went through those 10 years of difficulty. I can understand where people are and the problems that they have. So that was a very important piece. Now, Ken was acquainted with all of the people in the United States who were doing research with the psychedelic drugs, the psychoactive drugs. And I was going to take a vacation to Florida where my parents lived. And he said, oh, well, John Lilly lives in Florida. And he's very interested in this work, and he works with dolphins, and he works with music with dolphins. I said, oh, well, just tell me where he is, and I'll go down and visit him. So I called him up, and I told him I was in Florida. He was in Miami. And he said, well, come on down. So he came on down. So he said, well, I'm going to be up in Topeka pretty soon. And so we'll visit there some more about this. So he did come to Topeka, and he and Ken and I got together, and then the three of us shared all of our goodies. We call them goodies, the things that we did to get into altered states. And we thought the idea generated, we really need to get all these mavericks, all these people who are researchers and doing these fascinating things together, and not in a public place, but in a place where there aren't radios, TVs, telephones, and no tape recorders. Just get together and share. So we went out to Council Grove, and I said, I know there's a camp out here. We'll go out and we'll meditate here and find out whether we think this is an appropriate place for us to go. So we did. We meditated. And we got this idea that we should have a meeting, and the meeting should happen the Monday after Easter. So we made a plan, and we asked 8 people, and 4 of them were from the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center. And Stan Groff was there, and the Greens, and Ken, and John Lilly, and several other people came also. And what we did for 3 days was we just shared all of our abilities. And I shared my experience with music, and I was exploring the relationship between music and color at that time. So I had some research there that we were doing at that time. So that was the beginning of the Council Grove meetings, and now they still meet at the same place every year, the Monday after Easter. But it was at that place that I met Walter Pankey, who was head of the psychiatric research at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, and he told us all about his work. And he said that he would like to have me come. And I was asked to come not alone because I was a music therapist, but because I had explored these mystical estates, and they were very interested in peak experiences. Well, it was quite an experience to get into this research group. When I arrived, I found that they were using any kind of music, and I mean any kind of music. They brought in their favorites, and then if they'd heard from somebody that such and such a piece was good when a person was in a deep state of the drug. They'd bring it in, and then the clients would bring their own music. And it was just a mishmash of things. Basically, the sessions were one-to-one session. There were two of us therapists, a male and a female therapist. There were 3 female therapists on the staff. There were about 6 of the male therapists. So as a female, I had an advantage in being in many, many of the sessions. So I observed the music that was used and also served as a co-therapist. It was a tremendous training time for me because I came to learn a lot of the kinds of experiences that happen when you go into deeply altered states, and came to a feeling of feeling at home in those areas. It also gave me kind of an internal idea of what music was best used. I'm sure that in your training you've read the article that Walter Pahnke and I wrote on using music in the LSD psychotherapy, so I don't have to go through that. What we did, because it wasn't appropriate to use tape, and all we had was audio tape, of course, because we didn't know from moment to moment where a person would be. We would administer, well, the process began actually with some hours, probably 20 hours of psychotherapy with a person. And then when we felt they were ready for the administration of the drug, we gave them a certain amount, depending on, and putting in one general category, their resistances to getting deeply within themselves. And anyone who had altered states experiences of any sort, that would be hypnosis, meditation, prayer, exhaustion, a number of them, would find it more easier to get into the drug experience. And these experiences were used clinically. We used them clinically with neurotic and with terminal cancer patients, with alcoholics and narcotics. We also had professional people came in who were also given some hours of therapy ahead of time. And we were learning from them and their feedback how this worked with the general population. In the meantime, the drugs were pretty rampant on the streets. And we had people coming in who were from centers where they were helping people that had bad trips. So the session itself was about 8 to 10 hours. Sometimes it would go 12 hours. The administration of the drug, it was taken in a little bit of water, and then the reactivity physically was about 45 minutes. And then actually it was absorbed by the body, and the rest of the reaction was psychological. So it would come on very gradually, and then there would be a time of intensity in the middle of the drug, and then there would be a stabilization period, and then bringing back to normal states. So what we had were these records that were all in these, upright folders, and we'd rush over and get a record that would be in keeping with where the person was in their drug experience. During the experience also, we'd try to get them to verbalize, and we would help guide them, actually. So my first task was to try to find out what music was best for what part of the drug reactivity. And I did a little research with the therapists. And through this process of finding what they thought was best at what time, I came together with a body of music. We almost immediately found out that the classical music worked better than any other kind. We would use favorites for people at the beginning and at the end when they were in a fairly normal state. So we more or less eliminated all but the classical selections. I'd like to tell you one experience that was seminal in my starting to do the music alone. After 2 or 3 years of doing the drug work, which was quite exciting, but it wasn't too exciting when we give a drug to a person. They would go into evidently very valuable material and come out on the other side with amnesia. I mean, it doesn't help unless you have a memory for what you've gone through. And so I was thinking, well, we've gone through all this work and effort for 10 or 12 hours and come out on the other side, the person doesn't remember anything. So I started using just music alone. And one thing that they allowed me to do was when there were couples, one of the persons would have the session, the other person had to wait all the 10 or 12 hours. Because I was a woman, I took care of them, and so I'd say, well, come on, I'll give you some music, and we'll see if what it's like for you. So I remember this day, this woman came in, and I laid her down on the couch, and I said, now we'll just pretend I'm giving you the drug, and I'll start playing some of the music that we use. Well, for 3 hours, we listened to music, and she was talking the whole time, giving me all this wonderful imagery that was happening for her. And that's when the light bulb went on for me. Especially when afterwards they get the husband and wife together, and of course he'd had amnesia. He didn't have anything to share from the drug experience, and she was talking away. So as a result of this, then I started using it, first in groups, and I used a little research. It's in the book. And I found out very quickly that we needed some way to get people into a fairly altered state. So we started then using the relaxation that I'd learned from the hypnosis to get people so they're more receptive to the music and a focus place to start. And then I started using it with groups as well. It was a little later that some young people came from the University of Massachusetts, and among them was Daniel Brown, and some of you know of his work. He's worked in altered states, and he's worked with Wilbur in writing a book on the transpersonal. A very bright young man, and he said, you know, we have people listen to music, but he said what we do is like with the drug administration, we talk with them, and they respond, and they give us the images that they're having at the time. And I thought, well, that's great. And that's when we started doing the dialoguing with the one-to-one work. And also, Hans-Karl Leuner had come, and I had offered myself as a subject when he had used music with his work in the guided effective imagery. And I immediately realized that Hans-Karl was not a musician, and that I really knew more about what music to use. So that was another launching pad for me, which made it interesting. So then we started, I started thinking, well, this is working so well, especially when Sarah Jane Stokes came down after she had done a workshop. We started giving workshops, and she said, Helen, I really want this personally for myself. And I started giving her sessions then at the research center. And then I also decided to get my PhD, and I decided to do that because when you're doing research, you always have to wait on a PhD before you can go ahead with your ideas. And if you get one yourself, then you're free. So as a part of my research, I did 12 sessions, randomly assigned, of people mild to moderate neurotic symptomatology. Experiential group was the Ellis GIM. I had coined the term by that time. And the control group was using traditional therapy. And that research came out very well, and I had that in my dissertation. And it was with that research that I used Joan Kellogg's work she had come to the research center, and I found that doing the mandala after a session was such a good way to make more concrete the images and feelings that had happened. We took this idea to our staff because we had to okay everything, and they said, well, Helen, it's all right for you to do this controlled study, but I don't know about Joan using her mandala work. They said, you know, you're going to talk back and forth, and it's like two therapists and so on and so forth. So we decided that I would send the mandalas to Joan, and with a number, so she wouldn't know anything about what was going on in the therapy, and she'd send back the interpretation. And so that's what we did, and her interpretations were wonderful and very helpful in the ongoing therapy that I did with my clients. So one thing led to another, and Sister Trinitas Puccini visited me one day, and she said, I hear you're doing something interesting, and my friend Lou Savory wanted me to come and see what it's all about. So I gave her a session, and I gave Lou a session. And then he said, I'm going to talk to Harper and Row about a book. And I thought, well, nothing will come of that. Well, next week he called, he said, I think we have a book. Talk about easy. So that's how Music in Your Mind came out. And that was before we did any of the one-to-one work, the dyad work. That was actually at the beginning of my work with the dissertation. So the monographs are taken from the dissertation after we had started to do the dyad work. Then Sister Trinitas and Lou and I decided we needed to have a foundation or an organization in which to disseminate this idea and train people. So we started the Institute for Consciousness and Music. And the trainings at first were, listen to this, folks, 6 months. And then we found out they couldn't do it in 6 months, and then they were 1.5 years and couldn't do it in 1.5 years. And so I think it's inching up to 3, isn't it now? I think it is. So it was at that point, I think, wasn't it, Marilyn, that I can't remember at what point you came into the picture. Can you tell me? At where? Marriottsville. Oh, Marriottsville. Where Vince and Jane were there, and Jill Spencer. Yeah, right. She taught at that time. And then Marilyn was the first graduate, weren't you? Yeah. So stand up, Marilyn. Give you a hand. So those are the kind of the beginnings, and although that's a long time ago, it just seems like yesterday. And I'm sure that in your own work, you tell your own stories, and your trainers tell their stories. That's part of the whole process, a very important part. So do we have some questions? Or yeah, Marilyn?
I would like for you to add to the story Abraham Maslow.
Oh, oh yes, that is a nice one. Thank you. Of course, I had just adored the man from a distance, from his writing. Had read his writings and loved his ideas, and so on. I think it was our second Council Girl meeting. We invited about 45 people from around the country, and we invited Abraham Maslow, and it happened to be in 1970. Well, actually, it was the third one we had. And so I had helped Walter Pankey put on the conference that year, and I was allowed to do some of my own music research. And you know, I was afraid to go up and say very much to him. But this one evening, I had played a number of selections of music and had everybody lie down on the floor and listen to the music, and then write out any color relationships that came to the music. And the next day he came up and he said, could I talk with you? And So we went out and sat on a hillside, and I was just trembling. I was so excited to talk with him. And we talked for a while, and he said, you know, Helen, I think you're the one I've been looking for, who's going to bring these ideas out in music. And I was so thrilled. He was not too well at the time, and actually he died 2 months after that. So that's a very special memory for me. Thank you for reminding me of that. At the last chapter, I think, in Music in Your Mind, talks about taking it to Iceland. Isn't that in Music in Your Mind? Yeah. That came, I believe, in 72. I'm not sure. It was after I had explored and using the music. And the first tape that I put together was the positive affect. I was looking for peak experiences. And so, you know, I told you about the time sequence of this of the LSD, and so I used that same time sequence, and that's in one of the monographs too, so that I picked an ideal piece from each one of those time sequences for the positive affect tape. And then the first time I tried it, it was at Squaw Valley. It was a humanistic psychology conference. And that was before I realized that it's not too wise to do this with large groups. I was supposed to have a small group, and the word got around that I was going to do it, and I had about 200 people. And there wasn't room to lie down, so they lay down on the tables that we had there. Lay down on the hard floor and the tables. And, you know, crazy as I was, and it was toward the end of the conference, and everybody was in an altered state anyway, as they got at the humanistic meetings. And so I gave them the relaxation and the positive affect tape. And then at the end, you know, I always offered to bring people back. I think I was a whole hour bringing people back. But many people had peak experiences, and I asked them then to write me about their experiences. I had about 30 people write to me and tell me about the experiences they had, and so I knew it was important. So I took that tape then to Iceland meeting. This was a meeting of, the International Transpersonal Conference. Any of you who've been to that, I was the first one that we had in Iceland. But what was delightful before we had that meeting was I had put together a long imagery tape. It was the first one I did. It was about 3 hours in length before I shortened this one. And it was like this weather, only there was not that much rain. But you know, in Iceland at that time, there was light about 18 hours a day, 20 hours a day. And they went out on the grounds and danced for 3 hours. It was just wonderful to this music. So I learned from all of these experiences. And then the second one I put together, this group I spoke of from Massachusetts, University of Massachusetts, they wanted something that they could use that when people would regress to childhood. So that's when I put the comforting analytic. They wanted some music where they could hold the client and rock them. So I was looking for male and female voices and instruments that would be suggestive of a woman and rocking. So that's the way it evolved, was listening to this music. You see, I'd had the experience of 3 or 4 years being in altered states and knowing the experience myself, because we had to take LSD once a year ourselves. And I knew how difficult it was to get into those deep states and into the positive states. So it gave me an advantage musically to know that experience and to know music. And then I started listening to all kinds of classical music. You know, I've been a classical musician all my life, but I'd listen on the radio, I'd listen at home, and I got a big library. I have a very extensive library now. And whenever I'd find anything that seemed to be right, then I'd put it together. And I think that in the second monograph, I list those things that I'm listening for. There's something beyond that. And the other night when I was talking about Joan and my work, I was talking about the archetypes, and I'm sure that there are There are archetypal forms in music as well as in art that we respond to, and that we respond to as we become more involved spiritually in our work. So as you get in tune with those areas, then you also get in tune with your listening. And you know that two great differences, dynamically in music is too upsetting when you get into altered states work. Yeah.
What is your vision for the future of this work?
Okay. Thank you. I'm really happy to have you ask that question. I felt for the last year that I feel comfortable about our going public. I must say I have not felt comfortable until this time. When I first started this, I thought, oh dear, I don't know if I can take the responsibility of this. I knew it would do positive things, but I also knew that if the wrong music was given, that it might take people into very, very negative spaces. Well, fortunately, I find that when people, and then people would come to workshops or one-day experiences and go out and try it. Well, I found that usually that doesn't work. It just plain doesn't work. Folks lose confidence in those who aren't trained, or the natural defenses come up. So I haven't seen the negative uses that I was afraid of. The next thing was training, whether we can really train people. And I think I'm finally feeling comfortable enough about our training. It's a tremendous burden of responsibility when you start something like this. And as an innovator, you do feel this a very heavy responsibility. Now, I've had some wonderful help. Marilyn and Linda picked up the training when I became ill in 1979 and carried things along beautifully until we could disseminate the work as we do now. And I couldn't be happier with AMI in the last few years with how things have gone. So I'm looking to really get a hold of the caretakers and let them know what we do, and to let them know how serious it is and how much training is involved and needs to be. And I always say to professional people, you think you're trained in psychology, but you're not trained in altered states. You need to be trained in altered states. And so I think we're ready to do that. I think we have enough behind us to do that. It's wonderful. I think it's time to disseminate. And it's time for you who are fully trained to do that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you have any cautions about using music other than classical music? Would you say something about that?
I used to be pretty adamant about classical music just because I felt comfortable with it, and we had tested with it. I trust you all to try. I think that we can all try music, and we learn from that process. Very early on, I didn't want to hold this too close to me because I didn't know all the possibilities, and I still don't. I want people who are trained and able to go and explore this, and certainly to explore it musically. Classical music and other musics. I still feel that music of the more or less popular genre does not go deeply enough, and usually does not contain the archetypes, if I may put it that way, that the great masters of classical music have. And so I guess that's my question. Try it. See if it works. You know the safeguards. Mm-hmm. I think, too, that I must say, we also know how we get that wonderful richness of music inside through the classical music, and how we never get tired of playing that music. I've played it for 25 years. Recently, I've been able, in the last year or so, to take on some clients because I wanted to learn. And these are kind of difficult clients. But I wanted to learn more about the music use and about the therapeutic working with them in this genre. And the differences between using verbal and GIM, and particularly with clients that have more problems. That's a real difficult and important balance to have. I think that great music, if you get it into the person, then they turn on to great classical music. They'll want more of it. And it's almost like a food that you have to have. And so I'd like to see that happen. I wouldn't want music used that wasn't great for that reason. Oh, yeah.
You know, we asked the question, what is your vision of the future? And you talked a little bit about being comfortable about having GIM in the world. I guess, to me, when you tell your story, you talked about sort of the synchronous events, that one step would lead to another, would lead to another. I guess my curiosity is, you know, what are the synchronous events that are happening right now that perhaps are leading in new directions? Or for the method itself, do you see it evolving further than from what we already know as we know it?
Well, you're right, is that it kind of grew like Topsy. And I let the process, you know, we call it the GIM process show me the direction in which we go. And I'm not very much of a person to set out and make these great big plans. I'm sure I'd be a much richer person today if I did. but I enjoy this process that I have been in. It may be up to others to do that. I like to see it getting into clinical programs in universities. I like to see it being used in groups and medical groups, and I think that's going to be the big thing of the future, because our whole medical procedures are going to change, I think, drastically. And it may be very important for us to get out and speak for the arts and how they are healing, and from our own experience and from a serious position, so that we do get into those groups of care groups, whatever they shall be. And I know there are people who are making plans for the future, because this is a time to make plans for the future. I'm a big fan of Toffler and his ideas of the future. And he says we're in this third great wave, and we can see how a lot of people go on the underside of the wave. You know, we've regressed into conservatism in a sense. I was talking about it politically and other ways. And to me, I think we need to keep on the top of that wave and look to the future. I think community is the word. And we're getting community among us, but I think we need to get community with the arts. And maybe we'll have a little stronger stand if we do that. Because I think the old ways of dealing with medicine are going out. I really do. You know, the other day I was talking with someone, one of my clients, and I said, well, how about your medication? She was very depressed and anxious. And I said, how about your medication? Have you talked to your doctor about that? She goes to a psychiatrist. And she said, oh, yeah. And then I said, well, you are so depressed, do you think perhaps you should go to a more protected area, hospitalization? Oh, she just was up in the air about that. And so I said, well, let's talk about this. And she said, well, you know, Helen, I feel safer with this process than I do with any other process. And I think if I can call you every other day or so, that we can get through this. So you see, our clients are telling us these things. And I think we need to keep on top of the wave, and when we see these ideas, maybe communicate with one another. Well, let's do this, let's do that. I think I've done my bit.